Okay. Hi, everyone. I am the false philosophy bro for the purposes of this video. I'm going to do another one about Nietzsche and his opinion on truth from his book, Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense. Among other places, he talked about the subject of truth a lot. And I haven't double checked to see if this is an actual quote from him because people misquote philosophers on the internet all the time. But this seems to be basically at least expressing the sentiment of his thoughts on truth, which is that what is truth but a lie agreed upon, which is very fascinating, as is pretty much anything that Nietzsche says. And he gets into it a little more. So I'm going to go through my notes that I took on his thoughts here. And because, of course, since he's Nietzsche, he has complex thoughts about it. Okay, so it seems like Nietzsche basically thought that, okay, I'm going to go through all of this once and then break it down step by step. So, truth is an anthropomorphized metaphor based on culturally desired lies that we moralize based on our feelings about it, right? So, that is as nuanced and complex as Nietzsche always is, of course. So, let's go through this one step at a time. So, truth is an anthropomorphized metaphor. Okay, so it's a metaphor that we look at from basically our inherently biased human perspective, and it's not necessarily actually literally true. It's a metaphor because we know that human beings, since our senses are inherently flawed and we chunk information and miss a lot of it due to evolution because we had to be ready to run from a lion instead of noticing literally everything that we can possibly notice. So so truths are stories to us because they're practical. They're what culture wants to believe, which is kind of what Nietzsche is saying here. So truth is an anthropomorphized metaphor. So a story that we believe from our biased human perspective. And it's an anthropomorphized metaphor based on culturally desired lies. So it's similar to what he's saying in the quote here. What is the truth but a lie agreed upon, right? So it's based on culturally desired lies. So culture desires these lies to be true. Maybe we've already gotten used to these ideas that we seem to be true. And we know that when new information is shown to people, then we refuse to believe it and fight tooth and nail to deny it, right? This has happened throughout human history from the switching from the geocentric to the heliocentric model of the universe, of course, that the Earth is revolving around the sun, then rather than the other way around, got you burned at the stake for being a heretic, basically. And but you can talk about, like I was saying, ones that are already present in culture that are comforting that people want to believe, like this idea of the nuclear family, for example, which is actually historically pretty recent in modern Western culture, especially. And modern Western culture itself is very historically recent in terms of all of human history. But, the nuclear family, the idea that a family is a man and a woman in a heterosexual relationship with 2.5 children, one boy, one girl, and then one baby, and everyone has a house and a car, the American dream, so to speak, also. And people think that this is like true and natural, depending on your political affiliation, of course, too. Like conservatives are probably more likely to believe this. And most of culture basically follows these cultural norms, but much less so today than we used to. But basically, there's a culturally desired lie that, people should have families and live in happy families together. And this is what props up societies and creates useful people that get jobs and pay their taxes and stuff like that. But, Nietzsche would probably say this is is all flawed. This is all bullshit lies that we tell ourselves. You don't need to do any of this. And there are plenty of perfect examples of this. Like, you could go through any number of examples of just things that people believe to be true. Like, I don't know, the sky is blue, but at least scientifically speaking, we know that colors don't necessarily actually technically exist because they're actually just images that exist in on different places in the light spectrum from red shifted to blue shifted, and we see reflections of those lights on the objects that we're looking at. So, like I said, we can't even trust our flawed human senses. So, the sky technically actually is not blue. And things that we thought were historical truths are actually often false too. And, they're conspiracy theorists that think lies are true and that think that what culture believes to be true or lies, like all this conspiracy theory stuff with the Decepticons, aka the virus, and people are convinced that something is false is true, and then the anti-vaxxers are also convinced of that, and they're convinced that the other people are lying, but they believe the truth. And then in the postmodern era that we're living in, truth is a much more squishy and liquid concept, and due to the increased political division, basically heavily influenced by social media, truth is getting harder and harder to pin down, right? Which I think is a good thing in some ways, but a bad thing in some ways, because perhaps it's good for culture to have some culturally agreed upon lies, or truths, whether even if they are culturally agreed upon lies. But it's hard to say, and you know, something that's true to someone else can be false to someone else, and you know, obviously there can be different perspectives, and truths can change, and there can be different types of true also. Like I've said many times before, right? There can be, like, a truth doesn't have to necessarily be a scientific truth. There can be different types of truths, like scientific truths, such as, for example, um, or water is 2 parts hydrogen and 1 part oxygen. That's a scientific truth. Or gravity is a provable theory, so is evolution. Those are scientific truths. But you can say a religious truth, something like, I don't know, God exists, or it's good to be kind to others. These aren't necessarily objective truths, and, like, even especially, even well, even more so, less likely to be true is that God exists, but also that it's good to be kind to others. That's not exactly necessarily objectively true. If we're talking about moral statements in particular, I'm not sure. I'm not so sure there's such thing as objective morality. And Nietzsche talked about that a lot too, along with various other philosophers throughout human history, including, among countless others, of course, the so-called postmodernist philosophers or post-structuralists like Foucault and Derrida, who I've mentioned before, who I really like, in spite of them getting strawmanned all the time by public intellectuals like James Lindsay and Jordan Peterson. Anyway, so Nietzsche says, truth is an anthropomorphized metaphor. So, a story that we tell ourselves based on our human perspective that is based on culturally desired lies. Uh, what we see as truths in our culture that work well and everyone wants to be true. Um, and our biased human story based on truths about culture that we want to believe, that we moralize based on our feelings about it. So I was getting into that a little bit before, right? In terms of morality. So we moralize these culturally desired lies, anthropomorphized metaphors based on culturally desired lies based on our feelings about it. And we know this for sure too, based on what I mentioned many times before in terms of morality, because Jonathan Haidt, for example, who I've mentioned many times before, the moral and social psychologist, talks about the fact that in terms of human emotions, they're basically he goes off the intuitionist model, and basically you can prove scientifically in terms of neuroscience that how a thought works is that we go off of our intuitions and then we rationalize our intuitions. So really, morality is instinctual or intuitive, and like scientifically speaking, people are deluded if they think otherwise. Really, there's no such thing as objective reality as far as I know, but I wouldn't say that I'm a relativist. And contrary to the straw mans of post-structuralists like Foucault and Derrida, they're not relativists either, because among other things, some skeptics have pointed out that basically anti-foundationalists, or not necessarily relativists, but people who think that it's impossible for anything to be true, they have pointed out that if anyone says that it's impossible for something to be objectively true, then that paradoxically is actually also an objective truth statement in itself. If you say that it's impossible for something to be true, which actually Nietzsche himself is obviously saying, right? That truth is just basically this distortion based on our feelings and our flawed perceptions, the way we moralize intuitions and look at and create these agreed stories, culturally agreed upon stories that are not really true but serve culture, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I mean, Nietzsche, because he liked to be contentious, probably would say this in a contentious way to piss people off. Say, "You're fucking wrong if you say anything is true." And it can be, but truth is a complicated concept. Like I was saying, if we're actually talking about postmodern ethics, again, contrary to the straw man of postmodernists slash post structuralists, if we're talking about specifically quote unquote postmodern ethics, it's the idea that there should be rules, but they should be fluid and subject to change. And I think that's the same with morality. That's what Foucault and Derrida would think. And that's what a lot of people who just have, in my opinion, common sense would think. You should have moral rules, but they should be subject to change. Similarly with truth, right? You should believe that there are at least workable approximations of truths, even if they're even if at least if they have a reasonably high probability of being true that are workable, but we can understand that these are very subject to change and might not be true, which I think makes a lot of sense. And this is actually, I wanted to mention too, a way in which Nietzsche is actually more of a so-called postmodernist, or the straw man of a postmodernist, than the so-called postmodernists like Foucault and Derrida are, because he basically was a relativist and had this paradoxical opinion that it's impossible for something to be true, which is the straw man of what Jordan Peterson and James Lindsay say is the opinion of people like Foucault and Derrida on truth. They think that they're relativists, and they think that it's objectively impossible for objective truth to exist, which is not what they actually believe. They are basically pluralists instead of truth, meaning that there can be multiple different truths that work for different people, that can change across time, and they're culturally contingent and historically contingent and all that sort of stuff, which to me is just common sense and makes sense, right? So ironically, and Jordan Peterson and James Lindsay don't seem to actually know, even though, especially in terms of Jordan Peterson, it's hilarious because he talks about Nietzsche favorably all the time. But Nietzsche, in terms of his opinion on truth, is more of a postmodernist than Foucault and Derrida was, according to Jordan Peterson and James Lindsay's own definitions of them, even though their definitions are incorrect. All right. So I think I've said enough about this subject, about Nietzsche on truth, and that it is actually a lie, specifically an anthropomorphized metaphor based on culturally desired lies that we moralize based on our feelings about it. All right. Thanks everyone for watching this. I love talking about Nietzsche, as you all probably know, and even people who aren't into philosophy have heard of Nietzsche before. So yeah, check out my other videos on Nietzsche. check out future ones. Check out my last video on political philosophy, on anarchism, and check out a clip that's going to come out tomorrow about one of my Foucault videos. Check out the link for my Patreon page. Link is in the description as always. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. A lot of people watch the videos and don't subscribe, so please do so. Click that bell to be notified when I come out with new videos. And like I say, most importantly, always remember this: the funk cures all, and groove is in the heart. And philosophy is awesome, and so is Nietzsche. And read these actual books by philosophers like Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense by Nietzsche. A lot of philosophy books are actually pretty short. So yeah, read it and find out that these public intellectuals are full of shit when they talk about philosophy most of the time. All right. Thanks again, everyone, and adios until next time.